morning. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Midweek Recharge. This is Desert Highlands Baptist Church. I'm Pastor Will. We continue in our verse-by-verse study through the book of Joshua. We're in Joshua chapters 11 and 12 today, and we're actually going to get into a little bit more of the battle as Joshua and his armies try to clear out the rest of God's enemies and conquer truly the land of milk and honey, flowing with milk and honey, the land of the Canaanites. So where we were last week, we had the 5 kings of the south that were banding together, Jerusalem and Hebron and the others, banding together to come and meet the Gibeonites who had kind of tricked their way into the good graces of the Israelites. They had become allies, even though that was a directive from God or not to do that, right? But they were fooled. And the text actually tells us that the people and Joshua did not consult the Lord before they believed the story, shall we say, of the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were deceptive. They purposely were trying to keep from dying. Well, who could blame them, right? They didn't want to be wiped out by the people of Israel and the God of Israel. So they tricked Joshua. Joshua's mistake is that he does not consult the Lord. Well, now, the rest of the Canaanite tribes they are wise to what's happening with the people of Israel. And they have not really seen any difficulty in battle. The battle with Ai was somewhat difficult, but again, it's only because they do not consult the Lord and they start thinking that they are responsible, the mighty Israelite army, or the great mighty general Joshua, who is responsible for their great victory. So once they are corrected of that kind of thinking, things get a little bit better for them. So we're here in chapters 11 and 12. We're going to briefly go through 12. Today it's listing a lot of kings and the end of this victory. For the timing's sake, what we're going to talk about that's happening today is the bulk of the 7 years of conquest that happened in the first 12 or so chapters. And really, it's going to seem like it happens very quickly, but actually it's a summation, in essence, by the Lord, by the author of Joshua, to really talk about how that the Lord just kind of made quick work of all this. It actually happens over the course of most of that 7 years. What we've read so far through the first 10 chapters has happened in a relative short period of time, even less than a year, most scholars say. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, a lot that has happened. There's a lot of details as God prepares his people for entering the land, for doing what they need to do. But now there is much more of a summation about the result of much of the rest of this battle that takes place before Joshua really becomes too old to do his job. We're actually going to see that in chapter 13, where God says, you know what, Joshua, you're very old. It's nice to get some truth speak from God, very direct. You know what, Joshua, you're stinking old. And in chapter 13, he is perhaps in his 80s, we believe, 80 to 85 roughly. And so this is post-Noah, right? People don't live to be 300, 400, 500, 600 years old anymore. And so Noah is advanced in age. Certainly 85 isn't even necessarily our 85. He's a little bit more physically able, but an 85-year-old general is not going to lead his troops into battle anymore. That's not something he's capable of doing. So God will tell him, don't worry, I have this. And so when chapter 13 comes around, we'll have an interesting discussion about why enemies stay, why enemies persist after God says, I'll take care of them. Remember, he doesn't give Joshua, we're going to see in chapter 13, he doesn't give Joshua a timetable. He just says, I will take care of this. You're advanced in age. You've done the job that I've asked you to do for the most part. I will take care of the rest. But now today, we see the kings of the north. We've dealt with the kings of the south, but largely the kings of the north are going to come down and try to deal with Joshua. So let's look to chapter 11, starting with verse 1. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, the kings of Shimron and Akshaph. That's one that we weren't sure I was going to make today, Akshaph. Verse 2, and the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Nephath Dor of the west. Any Hebrew scholars that happen to be listening today, just cover your ears when I trample these names. I'm going to do my best, but there's some difficult names in this that you'll understand better in the Hebrew. Verse 3, to the Canaanites in the east and to the west, to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites. We've met some Hivites, haven't we? That's the Gibeonites. They're not the only Hivites, but they're part of the Hivite tribe. The Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. Verse 4, they came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Now, we've met a large army before. It was the army of the 5 kings of the south, largely led by Jerusalem's king at the time. What we have here is a vastly much more powerful army. And not just because of its numbers, but because of its chariots. Let me tell you what these chariots are. They are the ancient world's answer to our tank today. You know, a lot of World War II was changed on its face because of Germany's tank technology, and they decided to use what was called blitzkrieg, which was lightning war, speed. And so they would build armored vehicles and then run roughshod with great speed over people. In fact, when they invaded Poland in 1939, if you recall from some of your history, a lot of the armies of the Poles were still on horseback. And all they put up a valiant 20-day fight against the Germans. They eventually fell short of that because the Germans just had better technology, better weapon systems. You have a huge upgrade in technology in the ancient world when you have war chariots. To 2 horses pulling a large chariot, and in fact, the higher rank you had, you likely rode a chariot, if not a horse. But horses weren't typically in the desert regions. Horses weren't typically ridden into battle as much. They were reserved for those who were of great authority. So these chariots were armored. They were high above the ground, usually 2 or 3 feet above the ground. They were being pulled by 1 or 2 horses. Well, you typically had enough space for 2 people. One was a driver who had the reins to the horses, and the other one was a weapon specialist. Someone that either was throwing javelins, these are spears that can be hurled with great accuracy through the air, or you had a bowman, someone who was shooting arrows out of his bow, with his bow, against the enemies that they were fighting against. Egypt had an interesting little addition. Much of their battle chariots, they carried sharp metal points on the wheels of their chariots. So when they would actually literally ride by, they could just cut down whole brigades of troops with these blades that are on the chariot wheels. The chariot wheels were just as large as the chariot itself. They were tall, they were usually wooden, they might have been held together with different metals to kind of keep them secure. But the more advanced a war chariot, the more durable it was and the more punishment it could take. So really, you're talking about a situation here. Yes, according to Deuteronomy, Joshua has, at least technically, to his battle plans, he's got about 600,000 men who are capable of picking up a weapon and fighting. But that's not the army that he's taken from city to city. These are not the battle-hardened regulars of the Israelite army. So technically he has a very large force. But actually it's a little bit more, 40 to 80,000 that are really his core soldiers, the men that fight. Now we have it on good authority that he used just about everybody in his march around Jericho. Now against Ai, according to the scriptures, probably far less. Remember, he sent 2,000 or 3,000 against Ai, and that was a big mistake. He didn't even consult the Lord. The Lord might have given permission for just that many had he consulted him. That was the issue, not the amount of men, but doing it God's way. So here we have a huge number, but they also have their war chariots, also in great number. The reference here to numerous as the seashore, that's how many men is talking about. So they didn't all have chariots, but clearly these war chariots were a significant problem. Joshua has nothing. He has the Lord, obviously, but he has nothing as far as war material, weapons that can deal with these chariots. He largely doesn't have really any beasts of burdens. He doesn't have many animals for people to even ride. He doesn't have burros. He doesn't have horses for men to ride into battle. They're mostly on foot. So even though Joshua technically has great numbers that he can draw from, he's facing an uphill battle here. And it's interesting for you and I when we kind of look at something that we're going to have to face and we see its enormity. And we just take a deep breath and go, really? I'm going to have to take on that? And that's why the next few verses make the most sense. Verse 5, all these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight Israel. They're ready. They've gathered together. Verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, though, do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them slain over to Israel. God says, don't worry about this, Joshua. Yes, they are vast in number. Yes, they have impressive weapons, but I'm going to hand them over to you. They're going to be defeated. You are to hamstring the horses and burn their chariots. Now, it's important to see what we're looking at here, to hamstring the horses. This is a translation. Remember, of course, friends, that most of us are reading from an English translation, not from the original text of Scripture. Does that mean it's wrong? Well, it means that human beings were involved in translating what the original Hebrew, what ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek for the New Testament, what it means into English. And neither one of those, Greek fits better into English, but Hebrew doesn't translate real well. Neither does Aramaic real perfectly in English. So the translators do the best they can. That's also the answer to why there's so many English translations, is because it takes on the nuance of the translators. Well, I kind of think this. Well, I kind of think that. It's not a one-to-one translation from one language to another. All that means is that occasionally you're going to find less than perfect translations. Doesn't mean that the text of the Bible is wrong. Just means that there's difference of opinion according to the English translation. That's all. I think hamstring is actually the wrong word to use here. I think in our modern vernacular, it would be called fixing. When you don't want your dog or cat to produce more dogs and cats, you have them fixed. You take them down to a place to pound, or you take them to a vet and they get fixed so that they actually cannot produce offspring. Well, this is exactly what's done to the horses. Well, what that takes, though, is it takes a young horse who was a war horse, who could ride off into battle, who could carry multiple people plus a heavy chariot and heavy chariot wheels. It could powerfully charge them into battle. Is not capable of doing that anymore. These horses really aren't harmed. They are changed from a war horse into a beast of burden. So if it bothers anybody, I know there's always those questions, is God cruel to animals in the Bible? Well, animals serve a purpose, and they serve God's purpose. But God loves all of his creation. Make no mistake about it. We are his most important creation, human beings are. But God loves the animals as well. So there's no great cruelty happening here. What God is directing here, yes, burn the chariots. And the horses don't need to carry chariots anymore because we burn them. They're not going to be used in battle. Pardon me. They're not going to be used in battle again. So they're being fixed so that they really are going to be applied for different purposes now. They can still carry people, but they're not good for war anymore. Important distinction. Verse 7. So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. Verse 8. And the Lord gave them into the hands of Israel, just as the Lord said he would. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon. You can see at the top of the map. Well, it's hard to see where Sidon is on this map, but at the very top of the map is where Sidon actually is. They defeated them, pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth, Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. I can only ask you to believe that I got that right in practice. I did, and now I screwed it up. Verse 9, Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. Those horses now are no good for war. No good for war, but they will serve other purposes. And they burned the chariots. You might think, well, it's a good article for war. It's another weapon. But when you have God on your side, why do you need earthly weapons, right? You might say, well, why even carry a sword if you have the Lord? Well, God always provides us tools to do the jobs that we need to do. But a war chariot, that's actually at that point, now you're trusting in your tools more than you're trusting in God who gave you the tools. That's just what we're talking about here. Burn them things. All you have to do is trust in me, he says. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor. Remember the start of all this. Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all of these kingdoms. At one time, Hazor had been the king of all kings, of all the Canaanite tribes, certainly in the north. And so that's why still the person who held that position had great authority and great influence over the rest of those city-states. So that's why he could garner such support to meet Joshua and try to defeat him. Verse 11, everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and he burned Hazor itself, almost as the symbolic beginning of the opposition against God's people, God's forces. Right? Verse 12, Joshua took all these royal cities, put their kings, and put them to the sword. Actually, in chapter 12, we're going to have a list of them. And he totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Verse 13, yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds. This is when fortress cities, they were built up on a raised position, so they were even harder to destroy, harder to invade, built up on their mounds, except Hazor. Now, you might ask, well, Pastor, why did those get spared and Hazor did not? I can only give a guess. Hazor, of course, being the beginning of all this trouble, really the instigator of the army that came to meet Joshua and the Israelites. That's the one that is likely burned. Why didn't they burn the rest of them? Because why did God choose to burn one city and leave one alone? It's a good question. Although a city like Jericho was forbidden to be resettled. It was resettled later on in years, but God forbid that it be resettled, if you remember the text. There is no such stipulation in the text here for any of that to be duplicated with the rest of these cities. So that would say something. Maybe he said it to the people of Israel, and they do not, and they don't record it here in the scriptures. That's entirely possible. But you know what's interesting is Jerusalem is where Jerusalem has been. Jerusalem today is largely close to where Jerusalem used to be. The city of Jerusalem has endured for thousands of years. Isn't that interesting that it actually has not varied its site all that much, no matter who was holding it? And so many different armies and people groups have held the city of Jerusalem over thousands of years. So there is no forbidding of the people of Israel to take those cities and make them theirs. Why exactly God does that? That's interesting, right? We don't have an answer to that. Verse 14, the Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities. Right now, plunder is acceptable. When God forbid plunder, he did that for a specific reason, if you remember. He wanted to get the people's hearts in the right place. They were not there to plunder for themselves. They were there to take the land that God had provided for them. And so this wasn't about plunder and individual enrichment. It was about enrichment of the nation. So once they got that through their skull, they had to learn that lesson after Jericho and in the middle of Ai. They had to learn that lesson through that whole process and pay a very difficult price for that when they realized that the very lesson God was teaching wasn't that plunder was evil. It was that to take on the culture of any of these nation states would have been a mistake. It would have been a compromise. The only compromise that's in the people of Israel right now, well, there's the two tribes and the half tribe that are perfectly comfortable with settling on the east of the Jordan. And then, of course, there's the Gibeonites. Those are the great compromises so far to this point. There will become more. But all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone who breathed. They were completely wiped out. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua. And Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua was there when when Moses was given these commands. Remember, Joshua spent much of his time up on Mount Ararat with Moses as he was communing with God. Doesn't mean they were in the same place, but he did go up the mount with him. So probably a lot of this information he might have even overheard God say. That's my speculation purely, but he was very involved when a lot of these instructions were being given to Moses. And Joshua, of course, before he took over, he was the young assistant, the assistant to Moses. And you could tell that he was being groomed for leadership even back then. So as the Lord commanded his servant Moses, do everything that I command you, So Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it, just as Moses told him to. Verse 16, so Joshua took this entire land, the hill country of the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills. If you want just kind of a bullseye view of the land that was taken, you can take a look. You take a look at a modern map, actually, of the Sea of Galilee and the River Jordan, moving down into the Dead Sea. You can look at all of the land to the east of that, all of the land to the west of that, all the way down even south of Jerusalem, a modern day look at Jerusalem, and then all the way up to what is modern day Lebanon. All of that territory has been given to the people of Israel. And that's not on Israel today, but that was given to the people of Israel as Joshua took the land of Canaan. Now there's going to be other things that happen on the way towards settling their nation of Israel. But that's what it looks like according to the map. The Arabah and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, verse 17, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, to Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon. That's named for a Philistine and Hittite god named Baal. Below Mount Hermon, he captured them. He captured all their kings and he put them to death. Verse 18, Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. This is the verse that tells us that as we're reading this quickly, as the verbiage to these battles is being handled quickly, the details apparently are not that important. God took care of it. It just kind of reminds me about even the creation story where just God took care of it. Think about this, friends, the power that God actually has. The universe as we know it, creation as we know it, was spoken into existence. God spoke, and that's all he needed to do. It wasn't that he waved his arms around like some Mickey Mouse presentation about to cast a spell, right? Wearing some special hat and special clothing. It wasn't some great effort. It was simply a flick of the wrist. It was a twinkle of the nose. It was the smallest of gestures which displays God's amazing power. He spoke it, and it came into existence. The whole concept of him resting on the seventh day, we've said over and over again, and if you read the scriptures, you're left with an unmistakable thought that the seventh day of rest that we are to honor is for us. It was always designed for us. God's effort is minimal because his power is great. And he just simply spoke the universe into existence. Let there be light. Let there be land. Let there be sea. All was just spoken into from his great power. So God's taking care of this. God's great power is waging war. Joshua and his men have just lent themselves to be the tools of God. That's the mentality that we need to have as Christians, to just simply be a tool to be used by God. If we're willing to do that, God can use us. Verse 19, except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. So the Gibeonites prevail, mostly because they tricked the Israelites into giving them their word that they would spare them and ally with them. So friends, this is a compromise that will come back to haunt them. Now again, God approves of them not sinning the second time by breaking their word. That would have been worse. But God did not approve, clearly as the scriptures say, that Joshua did not consult God. He clearly did not agree with allying with the Gibeonites. They were supposed to be wiped out as well. Their culture is not better than the ones that Joshua has wiped out. They also have been prejudged with their sin. And now the Gibeonites will have an opportunity to intermarry with the Israelites. We're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? But they will have an opportunity to settle with and trade with and be partners with the Hebrew people, the Israelites. And so great compromises are yet to be had. Compromises that are not so good. So, they're the only ones who are spared. Verse 20, for it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy. That is exactly that word, exterminating them, wiping them out without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 21. At the time, and now we're going into something a little bit different here. At the time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. Now, who are the Anakites? The Anakites, or the Anakim, these are descendants of the Nephilim, the giants of the book of Genesis. When the sons of God came down and intermarried and had children with the daughters of men. Now, there's lots of conjecture as to who exactly the daughters of men were, who exactly were the sons of God. I don't want to go into too much of that today because it's very interesting debate, but it's not all that central to what we're talking about today. But these are the descendants of the Nephilim. These are the men that when the 10 spies, remember Moses sent 12 spies, I can't talk today, into the land of Canaan to look around. Remember, 2 came back convinced of the promises of God, Caleb and Joshua. The other 10 looked around and said, there are giants. We can't possibly take this land. There are walled cities. We have no chance. This is the men they're talking about, the giants. Now, he totally destroys them and their towns. You say, well, wait a minute. David and Goliath aren't for another 200 years. How is it there are still giants around if Moses wiped them all out? Well, let's take a look. Verse 22. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. Where was Goliath from? Gath. That was his birthplace. And what was Gaza? Gaza was, for many years, was the capital city of the Philistine army. Remember the primary army of David when he became the primary enemy of David when he became king of Israel? The Philistines. They were a thorn in his side for his entire kingdom. Constantly battling with them. At times even allying with them for other enemies. But they were a constant source of difficulty. Goliath wasn't actually a Philistine, even though he fought with the Philistines. He was an Anakim, a Nephilim descendant, a giant. The Bible actually tells us that he was 3 cubits tall. Well, 3 cubits, 1 cubit is roughly a meter or a yard, 3 feet, so he is 9 feet tall. That's what the Bible tells us. And the largest, if just by way of comparison, the largest man to ever play NBA basketball, the largest man in the history of the NBA, is a man named Manute Bol. He was from the Sudan. And he was 7 foot 8 inches tall. Now, he's a beanpole. Manute Bol is a very skinny man. And he even looked a little bit odd being so tall and so skinny on a basketball court. Actually a very gifted player, by the way. But 7 foot 8. So at that point, add a whole foot and 4 more inches before you get to Goliath. Impressive. Very impressive. And not a skinny, tiny man. Well, Manute Bol hardly could be called tiny, but not a thin man like Manute Bol. Mighty, muscular, powerful. Had to be an incredibly intimidating sight. But David wasn't intimidated at all. David came to Goliath and said, wait a minute, so you come against the armies of the living God? David wasn't arrogant when he met Goliath. He just simply said, wait, explain this to me. You're going to come against the armies of the living God? What are you thinking? And of course, David took care of him without much fear. He knew he had the Lord on his side. But that's how we know that Goliath came from this very thing. Goliath of Gath is actually an Anakim. Verse 23, so Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. This is fascinating because, as I kind of alluded to at the start of this thing, this in chapter 11 takes almost 6 years for this to take place. Makes it sound like it happened over a weekend, but this is actually the bulk of the battling that comes in the first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua. Now, as we look at chapter 12, I'm going to go through this rather quickly because most of this is just a list of the kings that have been wiped out. And the most important ones. There are more than just this list here. But these are the kings that have been wiped out during this campaign. And you can imagine if there are this many people groups that it took a whole lot longer than the weekend, right? As Joshua takes his troops and does as God commands him. These are the kings, chapter 12, verse 1. These are the kings of the land of the Israelites that had defeated and whose territory they took over east of the Jordan from the Arnon Gorge to Mount Hermon, including all the eastern side of the Arabah. Again, so we're looking at the east and the west of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and then what empties into the Black Sea. Referred to as the Sea of Arabah, but it's also the Dead Sea. It's that same body of water. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, he ruled from Aroer on the rim of the Arnon Gorge, from the middle of the gorge to the Jabbok River, which is the border of the Ammonites. This included half of Gilead. Verse 3, he's going to talk about, he also ruled over eastern Arabah, from the Sea of Galilee to the Sea of Arabah, again, as I said before, the Dead Sea. Same thing. To Beth Shimoth, Jeshimoth, and then southward below the slopes of Pisgah. Verse 4, the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the last of the Reaphites, who reigned in Ashtaroth and Edrei. He ruled over Mount Hermon, Salakah, all of Bashan to the border of the people of Geshur, and Maacah, and half of Gilead to the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Verse 6, Moses the servant of the Lord and the Israelites conquered them, and Moses the servant of the Lord gave their land to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh to be their possession. Now remember, this is the group that came to Moses and said, you know what, the east of the Jordan is fine. We have no need to cross over and take that land. Again, what was the plan of God? That didn't seem to be important from the two tribes and then the half-tribe Manasseh. That didn't seem to be all that important to them. What God's plan was, this is good enough. I've said this before, friends, during this study. As Christians, we need to be very careful about compromising with what's just good enough. We need to be striving to learn what God's will is and then to trust his power to accomplish his will. Settling, good enough, these are really not places that we should be as Christians, as followers of God. And that's what this group had done. This will come back to haunt them. Even in the book of Joshua, we'll take a look at that passage as we get a little bit farther on. But there's going to be a time where there's even a rift between this group and the rest of the 12 tribes of Israel. They will actually take up arms against one another. Why? Because there has been a broken fellowship. They are apart. They're not sharing the land together as the people of Israel. Verse 7, here's a list of the kings of the land that Joshua and the Israelites conquered on the west side of the Jordan. From Baal, again, there's that god Baal, or Baal, Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, to Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir. Joshua gave them their lands as an inheritance to the tribes of Israel according to their tribal divisions. So this will talk a little bit about tribal divisions. And in chapter 13, we'll start talking about how all that land is divided among the people of Israel. And there'll be kind of a different look that we'll take a look at that, but there'll be a different kind of lesson that we want to pull out of that. As fascinating as that look is as to who got what, there's a deeper meaning behind some of that stuff. We'll take a look at that next time. Tribes of Israel, according to the tribal divisions. Verse 8, the lands included the hill country, the western foothills, the Arabah, the mountain slopes, the wilderness of the Negev. These were the lands of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These were the kings. And of course, then begins a list to the end of the chapter of all of these individual kings. The important thing is, guys, is God is declaring who actually was given to the people of Israel. This is one more lesson that it isn't the mighty armies of Israel. He's giving this list because he says this is who was given to Joshua and his men, right? So friends, what does that mean for you and I today? What that means is not that God will give us victory over every challenge that we have, but God will give us what we need in order to be, well, on the other side of each of those challenges, exactly where we want to be. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. How many times have you and I been derailed? And that Proverbs passage is so, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is just so fundamental here. But how many times have we been on the wrong end of looking at something because we trust our ability to view it better than God's? God always has the panoramic view where you and I are looking at a situation too far away to make sense of anything and with too small a picture to understand the big picture. We need to leave that to the Lord. The one hiccup time that we see in the battle, I think probably the people of Israel did exactly as God commanded in chapter 11, because God just kind of goes right through the details. The details are not important. The victory is because Israel did what was necessary. So the bulk of the conquering of the bulk of the Canaanite lands is no big deal, because the people of Israel were largely responsible and obedient. Friend, how much of your life gets derailed because you are not terribly obedient to what God is telling you to do? I'm not talking about having a life of sin. I'm talking about a life of hard-headed disobedience. I'm talking about a life that looks at the scriptures and says, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I'm talking about a life that actually makes plans and goes out and experiences things without consulting the Lord first. Without saying, Lord, what are your plans for my life? Not just, Lord, if you would sign right here on my plan. If you would notarize that and sign on the dotted line there, I'll get to work. Friends, our plans need to be the Lord's plans. And the reason why chapter 11 and much of chapter 12 is a victory march, is a victory dance, in fact, it is because the people of Israel submit totally and completely. They already find, and it wasn't a happy thing with Moses, with the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Remember, this is half of the tribe of Joseph, named for one of Joseph's sons, so Manasseh. They decided that this is good enough. And yes, they obediently participate in the battle that takes most of the Canaanite lands. They are dutiful in that. But eventually they're going to settle, and I really do mean settle, for the east of the Jordan. You know what? If you looked at the east of the Jordan at that time, it would have been beautiful country. That's the trap, though. It was not the ideal that God had in store for them. So sometimes you and I might be picking just something that looks kind of nice, something that I can settle for, a behavior level that I can settle for, an attitude that I can settle for, a commitment to my relationship with God and the spreading of his gospel that I find acceptable. And not anywhere near where God wants you to be. Friends, you will never find true peace in that. You still might find a great deal of joy for everything that you do in the name of God. But you're not going to find a whole lot of peace. Well, what you're looking at with some of the maps that have been shown behind me is the vast territory that God gives his people. And because of those battles that happen through chapter 11, you have all the way up to, you take a modern day look at a map and see both Israel and then of course Lebanon right on top of it, east past, and then your eastern, not border, but your marks to look at is of course the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River running in between it. Remember, Og and Magog were defeated. They were the kings of the Amorites that were to the east of the Jordan. And that territory was given to them as well, all the way up to, not quite up to Lebanon, which is all the way up to, or I should say Beirut, which is all the way up into modern-day Lebanon. Not quite that far, but almost that far. All the way down past Jerusalem, down into the Hebron area. All of that land, all the way to the sea, and all the way out to the former Moabites and Amorites, Og and Magog, that were defeated even before they crossed the Jordan River. All of that was given to Israel. You know what's interesting? Israel isn't that big today. Not nearly that big. Because the obedience of God's people was not complete. Now, he's not asking for perfect, is he? He's never asked for perfect obedience. But complete obedience, yes. To follow through, to do all that God asks you to do, even if it's in a stumbling fashion, even if it's not ultimately perfect, because it won't be. But how committed are you to completely obey the will of God in your life? Finally, the people of Israel saw some real progress here in chapter 11. Not a piecemeal, but total progress. And it took not just a weekend. This is probably 6+ years of constant fighting. But then the land got to rest. Got to rest. That was 7 years. That's always the symbolic number in Scripture of idealism, right? 7 is perfectly suited. It's the word good in Hebrew. Perfectly suited to the task. And so now the land will experience years of peace to rest from war, because the people of Israel followed through and been obedient to what God commands. And all the land has been given to them. Well, thanks for joining us. This has been chapters 11 and 12, and we'll be diving into, we're going to actually do 13 through 19 next week. We're going to take on, there's going to be some very interesting lessons there as the land is carved up according to tribe. We'll take a look at that together. Believe me, we'll get through it. We will. Going not completely verse by verse, but we're going to highlight our way through those chapters. Well, don't miss tonight. Let other people know there will be a 7 p.m. replay of this very Bible study. Also, we continue to have on Sunday morning, 9 a.m. service on the grass. We'll worship together. We'll look at the Word of God together, and we'll just experience each other. We'll social distance. We'll have our masks on. We'll do temperature readings at the gate, but just enjoy being outside and being with each other. Remember to bring your beach chairs. Or a blanket is fine. Bring your umbrellas to protect yourself from the sun. We'll just lay out there on the grass. We'll experience the Lord's presence and spend some time in fellowship together on Sunday. So again, that's 9 a.m. We hope you join us at Desert Highlands Baptist Church. Have a great weekend, you guys. Take care.